Alright you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. This one's definitely like the other one, like the last one. Not this one, but that one. So check it out you guys. Some of you might have already seen the first original version that I dropped on this story. So before I go any further, let me explain what's going on and tell you guys why I decided to drop this video. So when this story first broke about a year ago and Ezekiel Romo, Wicked from BL Street, was taken out sometime around July of 2024, I had just dropped a video about 7 months prior to that was titled Panorama City, House Cleaning on BL Street. And the video told the story about how Wicked came up and how he was elevated into an influential position of power through his direct dealings with the Mexican Mafia. And then how he ultimately fell out of favor and met his demise in part behind cutthroat politics and unfortunately in part behind his own indiscretions. You know, I'll get back into the details of how all this came to fruition in a minute, but first I want to tell you guys why I decided to redo this video. So last month when I was working on that video that was titled To the Grave about the homicide that occurred in the LA County Jail's gang module, I talked to an individual that claimed that he was there in Centinela when Wicked got hit and that he also witnessed it as it actually happened. No, Spooky, which was my original source that gave me the information for that story, gave me a lot of great information, and the story was a good story. But I was able to gather a lot more details from this other guy that kind of filled in the blanks that I didn't have the first time that I ran this story. And based on the fact that I don't believe anybody else put this kind of detailed information out on this story, and considering how big this story was, I figured I at least had to run a follow-up on it. You know, I could have ran another story. You guys seen some of the stories that I previewed. I'm sitting on a bunch of stories. However, some of you that have already seen this story, you might not want to watch it again, and that's fine. But for those of you that are diehards and who get into these kinds of stories, I'm going to run it back and I'm going to give you the updated version that has a lot more details than the first time. You know, and after talking to this guy, I figured it was significant enough to redo my video and to include all the details that I wasn't aware of the first time. You know, the other reason why I decided to redo it is because I put a lot of work into these stories. And I know most of you probably won't remember this, but due to a YouTube glitch that I was dealing with at the time that this story broke, I was never able to monetize this story either. Remember when I had to title a lot of my videos Hawaii? Because the algorithm didn't like my titles for whatever reason. Well, after trying to plug in 1,000 different titles, changing out all the pictures, and trying to do everything I possibly could to get the video to fall within the criteria of YouTube's community guideline policies, I eventually just gave up and released the video despite the fact that it wasn't monetized. So that pretty much sums it up right there. But hopefully you guys still take an interest in this follow-up video, because again, as far as I know, nobody else on YouTube covered any of these new details that I ended up finding out about later, however big or small you might find them. And again, like I said, this is still a good story. You know, I'm not going to rehash the whole story, but I'm going to walk you guys through it and talk about some of the things that transpired in it, as they would obviously later factor in on the demise of the individual that this story was based on, Ezekiel Romo, Wicked from BL Street. So Wicked was somebody I told you guys about who had elevated himself within his neighborhood, BL Street. And he was able to accomplish this with fear, intimidation, influence, and both prison and street clout. He eventually became the de facto leader of BL Street. And a lot of the influence that he commanded was done by simply giving those that he came into contact with the impression that he had the blessings of the Mexican Mafia. You know, later on, Wicked was actually in line to become a made member of the Mexican Mafia. But this was later on in his career, and this isn't how he rose to power within his neighborhood. I'll go into those specifics later on in the story, but Wicked's rise to power actually started sometime around 1996 when he was convicted for manslaughter and ended up serving an 18-year bid. And it was during this 18-year bid that he became a steadfast believer of the Mexican Mafia. And at every given opportunity, he demonstrated that he had wholeheartedly bought into this belief system, mind, body, and soul. In fact, at one point, he even picked up more time for assaulting another inmate after he participated in a stabbing that was not only done on behalf of the Mexican Mafia, but at their direction as well. So Wicked gets out sometime in or around 2014 after serving this 18-year bid. And he comes out all hyped up on some DEFCON 6 stuff, where he basically starts to identify himself as being the general of Panorama City. And at that time, when he paroled in 2014, he was still under the influence of several Mexican Mafia members that he was in contact with. So my previous source, who I originally got this story from, Spooky, said that Wicked was intrigued and fascinated by some of the big homies that he came into contact with. Spooky said that Wicked started to act like he was one of them, and that at one point he even pulled him aside and told him that he was on course of becoming a made member himself. So when Wicked paroled in 2014, he basically brought the Mexican Mafia's belief system back out to his neighborhood, and he tried applying that blueprint to the streets. Across the board, in every facet of life, meting out discipline, strong-arming connections, taxing people, and reprimanding street people like he was some type of street-appointed authority that was vested with all this power. I mean, in one sense, I get it. You go to prison as a youngster and you end up meeting bona fide Mexican Mafia members, guys that were spoken about almost as if they were like mystical gods. And then you completely buy into their belief system. I mean, at some point, when we end up landing in the system and we run across these types of individuals, the majority of us try to emulate these guys. These are the guys that we want to be like. I mean, these are the guys that are at the top of the apex. So striving to be like the big homies and possibly one day becoming to be one ourselves, I mean, that whole mindset is part of the advancing and elevating process. Anyways, Wicked's own indiscretions would eventually one day catch up to him. Because although his intentions were initially good, it all started when he proposed the idea of kicking off a major house cleaning expedition in his neighborhood. And this was being done for the sole purpose of getting rid of all their rivals, the DOs, the hermits, the trash, the informants, the deadweight, and the do-nothings that had been accumulating for years. You know, keep in mind that this was an undertaking that had been addressed before in the past by several other members from BL Street. But Wicked made good on his promise, and he actually put his plan in motion. So at the direction of Wicked, members from his gang BL Street began to turn on each other and started taking each other out, which ended up resulting in a string of homicides that left 8 of them dead. You know, like I said in my first spill on Wicked, Wicked used BL Street to raise his own stock within the Mexican Mafia and vice versa. The same prison-based syndicate whose ranks he had hoped to someday join. So one of the first things that Wicked wanted to do was to make a good impression on the Mexican Mafia, a good impression on the big homies. And one of the ways he accomplished this was by getting members of BL Street to sell the Mexican Mafia's D, collect their debts, and by eliminating their enemies. He basically created a small home team of new puppets who were all sold on the idea of not only fulfilling the Mexican Mafia's agenda, but who were also fully on board with becoming predisposed crash dummies. Anyone who didn't comply or conform was eliminated. You know, if you could have taken a glimpse inside of Wicked's mind and seen how he was wired, it would have portrayed a portrait of a micromanager who only knew one response to petty slights and suspicions: whack him or take his win, because he knew better. So as Wicked languished in the power that he created for himself, he also slipped into the role of a radical hardliner. Here's an example. So there was a member of his gang, a youngster, that ended up getting an unsanctioned tattoo. Not for any reasons attributed to malice or anything like that, but because he was proud of where he was from and he simply wanted to represent it. But there was no intermediate level of punishment for this youngster, who again just wanted to proudly represent his neighborhood. However, Wicked's recourse was to have one of his lieutenants orchestrate his demise and to have him murked. No consideration about giving them the benefit of the doubt and teaching them why they don't do this. The recourse was simply to whack him. You know, later on, when that same lieutenant got strung out and stopped answering Wicked's calls, he lost his patience and ended up having him taken out as well. You know, Wicked didn't mind setting examples regardless of what position the violator held either. It didn't matter. But this wasn't his persona that he was portraying. This was the persona of some of the Mexican Mafia members that he had previously interacted with. And this is the thing you guys need to understand. BL Street never really got involved in Mexican Mafia politics. It wasn't their thing. It was considered to be one of the many street gangs in that region who honored and followed the Mexican Mafia's direction. But BL Street had never involved itself in Mexican Mafia politics, and up until that point, this was done by design. You know, from everything I was able to gather, I don't even think they've ever had a member from that neighborhood inducted into the Mexican Mafia, ever. Not to say that they didn't ever have any qualified candidates, they just never took that step. But Wicked, he envisioned something different. The MA needed feet on the ground to orchestrate some of the schemes that were being hatched in prison, and Wicked had the manpower. So Wicked himself became more deeply involved with working with the Mexican Mafia when he started working under 3 made members: Frank Playboy Fernandez, Raul Weddle Smooth Garcia, and Jose Cartoon Loza. And at that time, Wicked's role was crystal clear. BL Street would be engaged in collecting debts, moving clavo and muscling in on those who needed persuading, individuals who lagged and fell behind on their consignment payments or their monthly tax quotas that were already set. Wicked had the right idea. His thing was making things right for the Mexican Mafia, doing bottles for them, taking care of people in the county jail, hitting targets, getting rid of the deadweight, and removing all those who weren't in compliance with the Mexican Mafia's policies. And this was similar to the blueprint that he would later take out to the streets and apply to his own neighborhood. He basically became a self-appointed enforcer. And it all sounded good, but there was a lot of violence that came with that. And this is something that Wicked would end up finding out himself. So one of the first things that Wicked had to do was to get his own house in order, to cleanse BL Street of all those who were considered to be unworthy and who had no interest in conforming to the program. In Wicked's mind, it was simple black and white. You were either with it or you weren't. It was as simple as that. So initially, his intentions were to purge the gang of dirty homeboys, informants, addicts, dissenters, and anybody else who couldn't be trusted. The charlatans and the deadweight who often poisoned the younger minds who had taken it upon themselves to preach the gospel against the Mexican Mafia. So something that became inherently obvious, especially amongst those who were deeply invested in BL Street's internal politics, is that a lot of its own members started coming up dead around 2015. A number of them. And the writing was on the wall. The fact that there was no big push for retaliation against anyone who might have bore responsibility for taking BL Street members out, or the fact that there was never any elaborate funerals commemorating the memories of all those who had sacrificed their lives for the neighborhood, spoke volumes. Everybody seen what was going on, but nobody addressed it directly. And the reason why there was no funerals or any calls for retaliation is because all the members of BL Street that lost their lives had been taken out by BL Street themselves. They were cleaning house and getting rid of all those who either had smut on their names or those who had somehow broken the sacred rules that BL Street was now diligently enforcing. So once Wicked put all his players in position and it was time to start setting examples, it was go time. All gas, no brakes. Everyone who had an issue coming got dealt with, and nobody got a pass. It didn't matter who they were related to, how long they had been around, what they had done in the past. None of that mattered. Wicked was setting hard examples, and he knew that the Mexican Mafia was watching. So eventually, the ugly truth about what was really happening started to surface. Rumors started to circulate that a lot of their fallen homies had not been taken out by their rivals, and that this was nothing but a big smokescreen. Everybody knew the truth, but nobody spoke directly about it. They were forbidden from talking about it, because if they did, it would have been interpreted as if they themselves were second guessing or questioning the integrity of what was happening. And again, no one went looking for get backs, and no one tattooed the names of their dead comrades on their bodies either, because they themselves were the ones that knocked them down. The funerals and the car washes put on the fun them, the ones that are usually packed out, that you see spilling out into the streets, where you would see groups of homegirls wearing short shorts, holding huge support the cause banners. These things were sparsely attended. Some because of guilt, and others because by then the stories were clearly out, and now they were despised. From an insider's perspective, all the red flags were clearly visible. A stolen key of Yale, a young life snuffed out, all behind a setup and a quick lick. So as I had alluded to in the first story, there was a gray apartment complex on BL Street where a dealer who they called Chaparro or Shorty was renting 3 units. One for his family, one for his girl, and one so he could cook his D. It was basically his safe house. So this guy Chaparro, he was basically freelancing, and he had this particular apartment complex sold up on BL Street so that he could continue to run this small operation that he had established. And Chaparro was paying kickback taxes to Wicked every month for the privilege of being able to sell his product in an area that BL Street considered to be part of their territory. For several months, this is how they had everything established. But after Chaparro got raided and caught a dope case, he bailed out, packed everything up, and took off. He headed south for the border. He went to Mexico. Wicked, on the other hand, seen the silver lining, and it was nothing more than a greedy opportunity for a quick come up. So what does Wicked do? He arranges to buy another key from Chaparro's supplier, his connection, a Mexican national that was only known as the Paisa. And later on it would come out that this guy's name was Felipe Delgado. So the Paisa, he agrees to meet with Wicked, and this was all predicated on the fact that he considered Wicked to be a stand-up guy based on his interaction with Toppo. He didn't even know Wicked at that time, something that Wicked definitely played on. So unbeknownst to this Paisa, he willingly walks right into this trap. At any rate, Wicked takes the key on consignment and promises to be back with the money in a week. And again, this Paisa, he trusted him based off of his relationship with Toppo. So at this point, Wicked then moves on to the next part of his ominous plan. He starts spreading false propaganda about this Paisa, telling everybody on the streets that this guy's a rat, which of course was nothing more than a calculated and scandalous way of getting rid of him. He basically launched, which of course was nothing more than a calculated and scandalous way of getting rid of him. I mean, he basically launched an effective smear campaign against this Paisa, knowing that the consequences would be fatal. And Wicked did this knowing full and well that no one would doubt or question the validity of his word. Because in order for somebody to do that, it would be the same thing for them to question or doubt his integrity as a leader. Anyways, when Wicked started circulating this negative propaganda about this Paisa, his intended purpose was definitely to have this Paisa murked. You know, that's not the kind of jacket that you put on someone to get them packed out or ran up on. When you call someone a rat, which is basically one of the lowest forms of trash that exists within that walk of life, people are going to go after that individual with both barrels. They're not going to be playing. You know, again, it's all fair in the game of dirty cutthroat politics, but this was just a scandalous and dirty way of getting rid of this Paisa without having to pay him back. But these were the kind of shady, underhanded moves that Wicked had become accustomed to devising, and it was these same kind of dirty cutthroat politics that he'd been indoctrinated on during his 18-year bid. The only difference now is that he was implementing it on the streets opposed to behind the walls where he learned it at. So Wicked ended up keeping the money, and he obviously never had any intentions on paying this Paisa back. And he kept it all for himself. He didn't send a percentage back to the Mexican Mafia or his overseers behind the walls like he was supposed to. Anyways, Wicked had always believed that he had devised an airtight plan and that he had all bases covered in the event something ended up going sideways. He even created an alibi to fall back on to account for his whereabouts if he needed to. And he actually believed that he had figured out a way to utilize the GPS ankle monitor that he had around his ankle to his advantage instead of it working against him. So because Wicked was on parole, he was required by parole to wear a GPS ankle monitor on his ankle, something that he always had to be conscious about. He still needed to be strategic about his movements and mindful about where he was allowing them to track him while he was in his neighborhood. But needless to say, thinking that he was 2 steps ahead of law enforcement and that he was on his A game, Wicked moved to the final phase of his plan. He basically arranged for a younger gang member from Blight Street named Steven Mendoza, who they called Youngster, to whack the Paisa. And it made all the sense to Wicked. Youngster's involvement would never be exposed, and if he ever was caught, his culpability would be a lot less severe because of his age, and the Paisa would never see him coming. And Wicked actually believed that it would work to his advantage if the GPS coordinates showed that he was out in front of the apartment complex at the same time the Paisa was being shot behind the apartment complex. In his mind, this helped his alibi and proved that he couldn't have been the one to shoot the Paisa because he couldn't be in 2 places at the same time. You know, the plan seemed plausible, at least it did in his line of thinking, but putting himself in close proximity to a homicide would end up coming back to hurt him, and this would all backfire. So to further establish his own alibi, he went to his son's football game at Panorama High School and purposely made himself as visible as he possibly could. So as planned, at 5:30 p.m. on November 6, 2015, the Paisa was shot 3 times in the back behind Toppo's apartment complex. So after the shooting, the ghetto bird could be seen flying over the football stadium and all throughout different parts of the neighborhood. And as soon as he seen it, Wicked knew exactly where it was going. In his mind, the presence of the ghetto bird could only mean one thing. This was confirmation that the hit was carried out, that it was done. So later, following an extensive, painstaking, and thorough investigation, and after someone implicated him, youngster was arrested and charged with 1 count of first-degree homicide. Later he would end up being tried and convicted, but he wouldn't end up making it to trial on this case until several years later. So 2 months after the Paisa's death, Wicked was arrested with a half key of Chris in his car. The case was a slam dunk and trial would have been ugly. So Wicked ended up pleading guilty, jumped on a deal, and was shipped off to Imperial County Desert to serve a term of 4 years at Centinela State Prison. Ironically, at that time, Centinela just so happened to be known to be the corporate headquarters for BL Street. I don't know if it was done by design or if it was just a coincidence, but at that time, there was a heavy presence of BL Street gang members that had accumulated there at Centinela State Prison. But interestingly enough, it would also become to be known to be one of the power bases or strongholds for the Mexican Mafia and its following. So while he was there, Wicked had steady access to an open-ended supply of contraband cell phones and other contraband that was being smuggled in by prison staff or dropped inside one of the yards using pre-programmed drones. And because Wicked had access to these things, this gave him the ability to continue orchestrating his business affairs while he was there in Centinela. So the Mexican Mafia had Centinela sold up like the Nuestra Familia had Salinas Valley sold up. They had all the good jobs, they had COs and free staff in pocket, they had all the relevant jobs locked down, and they had a lot of influence with the administration that worked there. So while Wicked was there in Centinela, there was a fellow BL Street gang member that basically kept him up to speed and in the loop with everything that was happening on the streets. Anything that happened in the neighborhood, he kept Wicked up to speed with it. And this also included the matter of Isidro Alba, Toppo from BL Street as well. Once a leader of BL Street himself, by then Toppo was living out of his car, carving out a living by peddling Chris and shaking down other dealers. However, at that time, Toppo was out there playing a dangerous game, shaking down other street dealers under the cloak of the Mexican Mafia. He started telling some of his potential targets that he was authorized to collect tax money on behalf of several Mexican Mafia members that were in federal prison. Anyone who didn't comply was threatened and told that they'd be put in bad standings. But to a lot of individuals that had been around and who were tied in with other Mexican Mafia members, this seemed suspect and fishy. Especially when it came to light that one of the Mexican Mafia members that Toppo claimed to be collecting taxes for was actually deceased. Wicked, on the other hand, had previously warned Toppo to stay out of Panorama City, otherwise he was going to become worm food. But when Wicked went back to prison, Toppo began testing the waters and he started coming around again. People started putting it out there that Toppo was attempting to collect tax money again. And then a liquor store owner started complaining that he was being extorted. And that right there ended up being the final straw, as it didn't take long for this to get back to the 3 Mexican Mafia members that were in control of that area: Cartoon, Playboy, and Weddle Smooth. So at that time, Wicked still had an open line of communication with Cartoon, Playboy, and Weddle Smooth. But when they heard about what Toppo was doing, they started to orchestrate a plan to set a trap and beat Toppo at his own game. And this is something that Cartoon had already proven that he didn't have any patience for. At that time, he was facing charges for gunning down another Mexican Mafia member, Dominic Solo Gonzalez. But it was just ironic that Toppo was claiming to be working for Solo when Cartoon was the one that took him out. Either Toppo wasn't as smart or he was a little behind on getting the news. Anyways, on a side note, in an effort to help Cartoon and to help bolster Cartoon's self-defense claim, Wicked came up with a plan. And basically his plan consisted of Toppo going to Cartoon's trial and testifying on his behalf. He wanted Toppo to basically go in there and claim that Solo was violent. He also wanted him to give several examples of how Solo threatened him with a gun and to basically tell the jury that he was scared of Solo, that Solo was unpredictable. But Toppo didn't want any part of it. He refused to get involved. He said, "I'm not getting in the box and testifying about anything like that. That sounds like dry snitching to me." And this obviously upset Wicked because he felt like it made him look bad due to the fact that he wasn't able to come through and produce for Cartoon. Secondly, he looked at it like he gave Toppo a chance to redeem himself and he wanted to act like he was in control and like he was still calling the shots. And as it turns out, I guess he was, because he ended up getting exactly what he asked for. So Wicked nipped that in the bud real quick and decided right there that Toppo was done. So on the night of August 27, 2017, Toppo was waiting outside of a Target in Van Nuys for a customer who wanted to trade a cell phone for a little bit of Chris. So as Toppo and his girl are sitting there waiting in his Dodge Avenger for this customer to show up, Toppo's girl notices a black sedan pass several times. You know, Toppo, he's seen the black sedan himself, and even though he recognized all the signs as soon as he seen them, he still hesitated and he ignored his gut. And he knew, I mean, he must have really wanted this cell phone bad, because he even asked his girl, do you think this is a setup? And her not really grasping what was going on and being out of her element, instead of her being the voice of reason, she walks him straight to the edge of the cliff. And then she tells Toppo just hurry the F up while handing him the bag of clavo that was in the glove box. So against his better judgment, Toppo gets out of the car and starts walking in the direction of this girl that has the cell phone. And the next thing Toppo's girl hears is gunshots, and she sees Toppo running back towards the car with two guys chasing him that were both wearing hooded sweatshirts. Later, she would identify them as Juan Ramirez, Flaco, and Jordan and Neri, Little Goofy, who were both gang members from BL Street. She had known Flaco for years, and she got a clear look at him when he was standing right outside her window, right before he opened fire at point blank range. So when the gunfire stopped and Little Goofy and Flaco took off, she got out of the car, ran out in the middle of the street, threw her hands up, and started trying to flag down any oncoming car. Exactly what was seen on the video that would later be shown to the jury in court. So a few minutes later, when she was out in the middle of the street trying to flag down an oncoming car, she eventually seen a set of headlights coming her way. And in a split second, she realized that she had made a critical mistake. The headlights that were coming towards her were the headlights of a car that were being driven by Flaco and Little Goofy. She tried to duck and hide, but it was too late. Apparently, Little Goofy and Flaco recognized her at the same time she recognized them. So when they pulled up on her, they both stepped out along with the third guy, and they shot at her again. So she ran back to the car, laid down in the seat, and had the sense of mind to play dead. Toppo, on the other hand, was dead. He never even had a chance to grab the 38 that was in the glove box. You know, I'm sure that was probably his intention, but they ran up on him too fast, and by the time he got to the car, they were already pointing their guns at him. So Little Goofy and Flaco originally pled not guilty to taking out Toppo and attempting to smoke his girl. However, since then, they've obviously both been convicted. So when the black sedan pulled up that night and the third guy got out of the car with Little Goofy and Flaco, that was another individual from BL Street named Oscar Molina, who was also known as Smokey. And when Wicked went back to prison, Smokey basically became his right-hand man. And Smokey had also expressed an interest in stepping up and helping Wicked while he was doing time. "You need feet out here," Smokey wrote on WhatsApp. "Can't be in two places at the same time. If you could, you probably would." Hundreds of messages exchanged between these two illustrated the type of relationship that they had. Wicked, the demanding boss; Smokey, the funny middle manager. You're one of the few who I consider to be a good homie, a good camarada. So with that being said, just know that your boy will always be loyal, and I will always have your back for as long as I'm around. Gracias for your words, Wicked wrote back. They are a gift I accept more than money or shiny objects. So the crimes that Wicked and Smokey discussed on WhatsApp and were later dissected in court basically span the state's penal code. Collecting money from gambling parlors, extorting dispensaries, buying weapons at gun shows with fake IDs, obtaining drugs in Mexico, trafficking them out of state, and whacking an informant within BL Street. And apparently these messages also reveal Wicked's view, his gang, an empire, himself, a general, and his management style. Some say I'm too hands-on. You know, this was self-flattery at its best, but the one accolade that he definitely forgot was being security conscious. Because when his cell phone was confiscated during a routine search, he apparently didn't take time to delete all his old messages on WhatsApp. And this was a costly mistake. So among the witnesses that were at Wicked's trial was an individual that considered Smokey to be like an uncle, even though they weren't related by blood. Only identified in court records as witness number 2, he was the beneficiary of an extremely lenient deal, 6 years for 2 murders. And for those years, he would be allowed to serve under house arrest. And this same witness testified that him and Smokey talked to Wicked almost daily, sometimes huddling in the bathroom for hours at a time. And this same witness testified that him and Smokey talked to Wicked over FaceTime almost daily. And it was during one of these FaceTime calls that Smokey told Wicked that Carlos Rios, a BL Street hanger-on, had gotten a tattoo without being jumped in, meaning inducted without being beaten in. And Wicked told Smokey that nobody can have a B on his face without earning it. Take care of it. And this witness testified that although Wicked didn't explicitly use the words to murk him, he knew exactly what he meant. But I mean, even with that said, when you're out there and you're dropping bodies and it's not your standard protocol to be beating cats down or to administer beatings, you're out there dropping bodies, it's pretty obvious what was indicated. But this youngster, he grew up around Blythe Street gang members, and he attended Panorama High School until the 11th grade, when he was caught stealing a skateboard and was sent off to youth camp. Apparently, the reason why they took this youngster out is because he got a B tattoo on his face, but the jury ended up hearing the following account during the trial. So this witness testified that one of the shooters, a guy named Santos Raider Martinez, basically bragged to one of his cellies about how he knocked this youngster down. So this guy said that at the time, Wicked was mad. He was upset because Panorama City was burning up, there was cops everywhere, and Blythe Street was basically drawing the ire of law enforcement. So Smokey, Raider, and his brother, Neftali Martinez, drove Rios to Van Nuys, basically leading him to believe that they were going to a rival's neighborhood to strike it up, to tag all over the walls, meaning to go down there and tag their neighborhood with cans of spray paint, write Blythe Street all over the walls, and represent themselves. So this guy goes on to tell the story about how this youngster Rios jumped out the car and wrote BST, Panorama City, and Blythe Street on a wall. And then Raider tells him to keep on tagging. And while he's tagging, he domes him. He shoots him in the back of the head. But this youngster don't die, despite the fact that he emptied his whole clip in him. So Neftali Martinez gets out the car and he basically finishes him off. So later on, prosecutors also charged Wicked with 3 other homicides in relation to 3 other people that got murked behind a long-running feud between Blythe Street and one of its rivals, the Columbus Street Gang. So on the night of November 17, 2017, Alexis Saldana pulled onto Blythe Street with 300 Columbus Street gang members and yelled out, "F burros." Burro means donkey in Spanish, but it's also a derogatory term to describe gang members from Blythe Street. And then Raider goes on to tell the story about how he chased one of them to a Wendy's and ended up taking him out. He said that he shot this guy in the back of the head, and that after he shot him, he stepped on the gas, and that this guy drove his car through one of the restaurant's windows. And then a month later, James Smiley Rodriguez, another gang member from Columbus Street, whom Smokey had warned to stay out of Panorama City, was shot in front of a Denny's restaurant where this witness's wife worked waiting tables. And she would also later testify at this trial. And she said that after Raider told her that he shot this individual, that he told her, "El pobre pendejo" had been murked too, meaning poor bastard in Spanish. And this was obviously a derogatory term to describe Columbus Street gang members. So the day after these 2 homicides took place, Smokey jumps on WhatsApp and basically tells Wicked 2 more calabazas down. And keep in mind that some of these messages that these investigators later intercepted off of WhatsApp was corroborating information that they had already got from their informants. So this was damaging information. So at one point, Wicked would berate Smokey for not answering his phone or for not returning his calls. And Smokey ended up responding with a long apology, basically saying that, sometimes I'm not having a good day, and when you jump on me, I'm not always in the best place either. And apparently sometimes he would even shoot up while they were huddled up in the bathroom on FaceTime with Wicked. The same way someone would just spark up a cigarette would be the same way that Smokey would pull out a cooker and start cooking up his D. And if Wicked had a problem with it, he held his tongue and never said nothing about it. But apparently if you were strung out, Wicked seen it as a weakness and you were somebody that couldn't be trusted. And this was despite the fact that I'm sure Wicked had seen plenty of high-ranking Mexican Mafia members use Garaga when he was behind the walls with them. But apparently because of his addiction, Smokey had been on borrowed time. He just didn't know it. So one of the last messages that Wicked sent Smokey on WhatsApp was the following: "There's only 24 hours in a day. Money never sleeps." And it's obvious by this message that Wicked was irritated with Smokey for not answering his phone. So around 4 a.m. on February 10th, 2018, Smokey told his girl that he was going to step outside their apartment for a minute. He told her he'd be right back, and then he tucked a revolver in his waistband and he stepped outside the door. And as soon as he stepped out, he was shot by one of his longtime friends from Blythe Street, a guy named Eater Mendoza. And later on it would come to light that another Blight Street gang member named Lorenzo Gonzalez acted as his lookout. So later on during the trial, one of the witnesses that testified against Wicked told the jury that Wicked had told him that he took Smokey out because Smokey could no longer be trusted and that he was way too heavily addicted. You know, those were just justifications. What it all really came down to is that Smokey had challenged and undermined Wicked's authority one too many times. You know, not only that, but Wicked took insubordination on any level as a personal affront to his own ego. So 12 days later, Eder Mendoza and Lorenzo Gonzalez picked up Karen Tobar in an unlicensed taxi called a Bandit Cab. And apparently Tobar was at Smokey's apartment the night that he was taken out. You know, it's pretty clear why they took her out. These were the same two that took Smokey out, so they were eliminating any possibility of any witnesses. Her body was found in Silmar Park the following morning. She had been stabbed 60 times. They took her for a one-way walk into that park because they obviously believed that she was going to call the cops and tell them everything that she knew about Smokey's demise. In fact, word on the streets was that she might already talk to investigators that had been asking questions, and that despite their best efforts, it might have been too late. You know, the other thing that Wicked exploited was his size. He stood at a towering 6'2" and tipped the scales at a solid and chiseled up 230 pounds. Characteristics that he learned from some of the other hardline Mexican Mafia members that he was around in prison. He couldn't stand do-nothings. If you were from the hood and you claimed Blight Street, you had to make as many sacrifices as everyone else. Period. You know, one might ask, why would you take out your own homeboys or other gang members from your own neighborhood? And in Wicked's mind, it was simple. It was a matter of asserting dominance and control. Because in Wicked's world, if you didn't fit the mold and you didn't do what he wanted you to do, then you got taken out. So after Wicked was convicted of homicide, attempted homicide, and conspiracy to commit homicide and sent to prison, and when he landed there in Centinela, there just so happened to be some longtime senior Mexican Mafia members that had been there for a while. It was Joker from Hazard, Sleepy from Wilmas, Chato from Laverne, Chino from Norwalk, and Ronnie Ayala from San Diego. And unbeknownst to Wicked at that time, these would be the Mexican Mafia members that would be tasked with running a full investigation on all of Wicked's activities. You know, for the most part, everyone knew what happened on his face insofar as who Wicked had taken out, the hard line that he was out there pushing, the taxation program that he implemented on the streets. You know, just the fact that he was out there flouting himself as someone who was pushing his self-vested status was enough to rub several Mexican Mafia members who were aware of what he was doing the wrong way. You know, it becomes a situation where people start asking themselves the question, who the fuck did this dude think he was out there? You know, Wicked honored the Mexican Mafia and wholeheartedly believed in this organization's purpose and philosophy. But one of the main contentious issues that was being looked at was how Wicked was representing himself out there on the streets. You know, there was reason to believe that he was actually representing himself to be a made member of the Mexican Mafia. The same reason why he greenlighted Toppo, Isidro Alba from Blight Street. You know, not just as an extension or someone who had the organization's backing, but as someone who was already a foot in the door. And this was substantiated by several different people. You know, Sleepy, Joker, Chino, Chato, and Ronnie definitely had their work cut out for them. And misrepresenting yourself as being a made member of the Mexican Mafia had been the basis for several homicides that had been committed before in the past, especially when money was being collected under these pretenses, something that Wicked was now being accused of. You know, according to Spooky, my original source who I got this story from, and this guy that I just recently talked to, this investigation took several months to sift through. They reached out to several people on the streets that Wicked had come into direct contact with, and then in the end, a vote was held. In the interim, Wicked was embraced and was treated with respect like any other Sureño on that yard. However, during the last few months while the investigation was waning, Wicked apparently seen something that made him uncomfortable. You know, Spooky said that some people are extremely savvy when it comes to deception. They can look you in the eyes, set you at ease, and get you to drop your guard while at the same time hiding their true intentions. Others just aren't as savvy no matter how much glacier or schooling they've been exposed to. Something that I've said before myself. Spooky thinks it might have been one of those who didn't know how to master their deception that might have created the red flags in Wicked's mind. And Wicked wasn't no dummy by a long shot either. When you do an 18-year bid, you absorb a lot of game and you learn a lot. You hone in on a lot of the survival characteristics that help you identify with things like this. You know, Spooky said that Wicked even went as far as expressing some of his concerns to some of the Mexican Mafia members that were there in Centinela. Wicked indicated that he knew he messed up and he knew he made a lot of mistakes when he was on the streets. but that he was willing to do whatever it took to put this behind him. You know, this clearly demonstrated that Wicked was definitely concerned about what was going to happen and that he was thinking about damage control. So when the investigation concluded, he obviously failed to draw any sympathy from those that held the power to decide his fate. The deciding factors were the allegations of him misrepresenting his status as being a made member, the circumstances surrounding Toppo's demise, and the fact that he didn't afford no sympathy to the people that he had murked out there on the streets either. His recourse was to whack him. So in the end, the powers that be decided that when you live by the sword, you die by the sword. Once it was decided that Wicked would be taken out, Spooky said that the Mexican Mafia members that were there in Sentinella convened and orchestrated the hit first by selecting the shooters. And apparently this wasn't a complicated task either, as there was plenty of Sureños who were there that were more than qualified and willing to take on this assignment. There were a lot of hitters on that particular yard who were hungry and anxious to earn their bones. In the end, Johnny Garcia, Stomper from Compton Barrio Largo, Christian Moreno, Fat Kid from Florencia, and Christian Hernandez, Shorty from Pacuema were the three shooters who were chosen for this assignment. You know, Spooky said he gives Wicked some credit for staying on that yard and for not checking out like a coward. He was dragging and he was basically isolating himself from everyone else. But he obviously decided to stay on the yard and accept his fate like a soldier. So on July 21st, 2024, Wicked was programming in the building with the rest of the Sureños on their side of the building when Shorty, Stomper, and Fat Kid advanced on him with bangers. And according to Spooky, it was a vicious hit. These guys had bone crushers, and despite Wicked's size, he didn't stand a chance. So Stomper was the first one to hit Wicked with either a head or a neck shot. Spooky said it sounded like someone got smacked with a baseball bat. That's how hard Stomper hit him. Wicked was stabbed close to 50 times as all three of these guys stayed on him. You know, and this was a sanctioned murking by the Mexican Mafia, something that Stomper, Fat Kid, and Shorty were all made well aware of. You know, some of the responding floor officers attempted to intervene by using less than lethal means, chemical agents and pepper spray to stop the assault. As they were stabbing Wicked, they were purposely avoiding direct contact with the pepper spray by closing their eyes and turning their heads at all the right times. You know, and this is a tactic that I've seen before that's been effectuated by other hitters before in the past. So the first application, which was basically a whole can, failed to have any effect at all. Spooky said they just kept stabbing him and they wouldn't let up on him. They were hitting him in the neck, head, and face. And even though Wicked was trying to fend off and block some of what they were giving him, he was only able to do so much. And the second application of chemical agents didn't have much of an effect on the three shooters either. Unfortunately for Wicked, they continued to stab the life out of him. And for all those who were watching, it started to become obvious that they were watching someone lose their life. You know, believe it or not, the human body is pretty resilient and can withstand a lot of punishment. You know, you'd be surprised how much it could actually take. But on the flip side, it also does have its limits. And it just isn't able to withstand the type of trauma that these types of weapons cause, especially when some of your major organs are being perforated by bone crushers. So the responding officers then moved in with the third application of chemical agents. And although this still didn't stop them from stabbing Wicked, you could tell that the chemical agents were starting to have an effect on the three shooters. And although this still didn't stop them from stabbing Wicked, you could tell the effects of the chemical agents were starting to take effect. But it wasn't until the officers had finished administering the fourth application, the fourth can of chemical agents, that they finally stopped stabbing Wicked. But by then it was too late. Wicked had sustained mortal injuries and was basically bleeding out and dying at that point. And my other source that I just recently talked to said that when he looked over at Wicked, he could tell by the expression on Wicked's face that Wicked knew he was dying as well. He said Wicked was laying on his back and he lifted his head off the ground and he just looked around, almost as if he was taking everything in and telling himself that this is how it all ends right here. And not long after that, he passed out. So once the three shooters were cuffed up and secured, Wicked was taken to an on-site medical facility. However, despite the vigorous efforts made by medical staff to preserve Wicked's life, he was pronounced deceased about an hour later. So today, BL Street is a quiet neighborhood. What once served as the stomping grounds to a teeming and thriving gang just seems quiet and almost like it's been restored with some level of normalcy. But don't be fooled by what you don't see, because just right there, somewhere lurking close under the surface, they're just rebuilding and trying to regenerate from some of the losses that it sustained. At least the ones that are able to withstand the test of time and the ones that are able to bounce back after something like this. You know, in closing, I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of people that are going to say that Wicked got what he had coming to him. Especially when you think about all the families of the victims that he had taken out. Or even when you think about the victims themselves. Either an eye for an eye or nothing positive is ever gained if the cycle of violence is allowed to continue. You know, in some respects, Wicked also became a victim himself. His mistake was buying into a belief system that had no boundaries. A belief system that not only advocated for violence, corruption, and self-destruction, but a belief system that has also become rife with political agendas and cutthroat politics. Something that's definitely become a common theme within these stories. You know, perhaps Wicked said it best when he shot a text to Smokey 6 weeks before he had him taken out. You can judge a real man's worth by the success of those around him. Either they'll maximize that success and they'll continue to build in unison, or corruption will stagnate their efforts. And in the end, the entire ship will sink, taking them all down together. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys liked this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. And again, something else that's extremely important that I'm going to continue to keep reminding you guys about is to not only hit the like, drop a comment and share the video, but also hit the all symbol on the notification bell so that you're notified anytime I drop content on this channel. So with that being said, as always, I just want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and also for continuing to tap into this channel. In the meantime, you guys enjoy the rest of your day and keep pushing that positivity. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.